let me teach you about game mastering. We're going to focus on genre, the imagination, and creating the feel and the experience that you want your players to have in your game. Well, let's be clear. In a tabletop role-playing game, everything is filtered through the imagination. When a person has their imagination on the go, it's well developed. It does not take that much to fire up that imagination. You don't have to give a long-winded speech to get that person thinking. Only a few simple words can do the trick. Why is this important? Well, because if you give me a genre, but I don't do the right things with it as the person that will run the game master, my players will not feel and experience that genre. What might I be doing that would be failing my players? Well, maybe it's small things. Like they're in a Star Trek game. Well, on the ship, there's all kinds of noises, little things going on. Now, you don't always have to detail out every noise or every little crook and cranny of things that are happening. But if every so often you remind players that there's a noise when they press that button, there's a noise when they walk through that door. You don't have to point it out every time they walk through a door, but every so often when they walk through the door, you remind them about what they're hearing. So it reminds them where they're at. It helps a player paint their imagination. It's clever. It's like scattered little reminders of what's happening, the noises. Because you, Game Master, you are the world. So when they encounter the world, when they encounter that genre, you are expressing it. And if you're not doing that stuff, you're not expressing it. And the player doesn't require that you give long-winded speeches to remind them about where they're at or what's going on. It doesn't take much. Little reminders about the atmosphere or, the place that they're in or the noises that they're hearing. It's enough to keep them in that atmosphere and remind them where they're at so they start feeling like they're in that Star Trek game. There's many ways to express a genre. Maybe it's through the non-player characters. Maybe it's through the books that the characters are finding and reading, about the world. You can give them information. It's a combination of things, right? From the imagination to the experience of, being in dialogue with certain people from that genre, from that time. All that can paint a picture, can create a feel for the player that, they are playing in a Star Trek game and it feels like Star Trek. I mean, even the mindset that you want players to be in with their characters given a situation, well, they're only going to get into that mindset if their imagination is really fired up. Like, they're in the forest and their character is damp. They're wet from rain or whatever. And it's really drenched out. And you want to create that atmosphere because, you want players to be reminded about the situation their characters are in. It doesn't feel great. They're not going to talk pleasant. Maybe it's really uncomfortable. So you got to point out to them, your character's skin, it's like sticky from the dampness, from the wetness. And it is wet everywhere. Like you are drenched. Your hair is soaked. And players are great. They'll take that in. They start imagining what their characters are feeling like. Wow, I'm in a shit spot. And the language, the dialogue they start using for their characters makes more sense to the character's actual situation, right? Like, now they start reacting like that is the case, and all you had to do was give a few little details, and you've created the atmosphere, you put them in that situation, and now they're in the mindset. If you don't mention little things like this, or maybe you just sort of mention it early on, players might react like, that's not the situation their characters are in. They might not feel that atmosphere. They might not feel anything because you're not really painting it up in the imagination so they can imagine what their characters are going through. In 2024, I hear a lot of game masters giving out these long-winded speeches, but then failing to do the little things. And to me, it's the little things, the little details that are way more important because overall, that's painting the whole picture for the players. Those little details are more effective on the minds of the players than some long-winded speech about where they're at. The longer-winded it is, the easier it is for your players to forget what you said. And the more you try to paint the picture, like the more you complicate the way the picture gets painted, the harder it is for your players to paint the picture from your explanation. Your long-winded explanation starts messing with their imagination. You don't have to do all that. You only have to do a little bit to trigger the imagination, and the players take care of the rest. You know this. You know this from reading books and watching movies. You know they can leave a mystery in front of you. You know, they can barely tell you what's going on, and your imagination will instantly take over and powerfully take over. Well, guess what? When you're running a game, if you do it in a certain way, your players, their minds, like yours, when you're reading that book, get triggered the same way, and their imaginations will be fired up in the exact same way your imagination is fired up when you watched that movie or read that book. See, what a lot of young game masters don't realize is the long-winded speech is not that effective. What you really want to do is paint the picture over time. It's like you don't want to paint the entire picture just all at once. You want to be given pieces, given information, make it simple so your players take it in, understand it, there's no confusion, and they're not trying to take in too much at once. They're taking in just enough to start developing that picture in their own mind. And you're just going to keep adding to that, like layers upon layers, from the atmosphere, from the way the non-player character talks. It will all be layered onto creating the actual feel, of the genre, feel of the time, feel of the place. So your players feel like they're, again, in that Star Trek game, on that Star Trek spaceship, right? Or on that weird, alien planet, doing what Star Trek people do, feeling like they are in a Star Trek game. If you don't do this stuff, what you end up creating in a lot of cases is a generic, maybe like for the Star Trek example, like a generic space game that isn't really Star Trek, right? It isn't really what you want it to be. You could take a generic space game, and if you do it right, like run it the way I'm suggesting, you can make that generic game feel like Star Trek. But again, if you do it wrong, you can take the Star Trek game and make it feel like a generic space game. That's it. So the minor things like the noise coming from the button, or just the way the non-player character will speak about, the situation, the timeline, their surroundings, all that, all those minor things, when they come together, when they combine in the mind of the player over time, well, then they get what they want out of the game, and you're giving them what they want out of the game. There are a lot of try-hard game masters out there that they just don't get it. You don't have to try that hard. Actually, it's way more simple. Game mastering is an art. The best ways of game mastering are not taught to you in any book. You won't learn them in any book. You gotta do the thing over and over and over again for a long period of time to learn all the minor things you got to do to be an actual good game master. And none of it is found in any books. Not the old D&D books, not the new D&D books, not the vampire games. Nowhere. How you learn is just through the experience of watching your players, listening to your players, seeing their reaction, talking to them, looking at your own experience and how it feels to you, how it comes across, and then looking at what you do compared to the real world, like in other areas outside of your little fantasy game. When it comes to watching movies or doing something else, like, are you doing something similar? Well, you are. And when you look at what's happening with you as you watch a movie or read a book or do something else, outside of your little fantasy game, you start realizing how easy it is to relate those things to what you're doing and then discover little things through that process. Well, if the imagination so easily fires up watching the movie on this little bit of information, well, then why am I giving a long-winded speech at my game? Because when we take the time to look outside of our little fucking fantasy game and we look at the world, we see similar things happening, but what we're doing is not what's being done to achieve those things. So when you look at what's being done to achieve those things, well, you find out it's way more minimal. It's way more genius in that aspect, right? Like, it's the artist understands the mind of the audience. They're not going to overkill. They're going to make things more simple, right? And they'll understand that they're confusing the audience if they go to a more complicated place, right? You'll notice that people in Hollywood, artists, they know this. They actually know that the overkill doesn't work. So they know if they're messing with the audience's mind, and they'll actually openly talk about this. So why wouldn't we understand that if we get too long-winded, if we try too hard as game masters, we'll end up overshooting what we're actually trying to achieve. And it won't work. And I got to tell you, long-winded speeches don't really work. I'm being real with you. They don't work. They don't create the feel. They don't create the atmosphere. It's a bunch of information at once that's hard to take in for your players in most cases. So remember, the imagination is where the game is. It's where everything about the game is. And that's the feel, the experience, everything. And if you know how to play with that right as a game master, you can create whatever your players want. But if you don't know that it's an art, if you don't realize you got to learn this just through, experience doing this, well, then you're going to sit there and get into a zone, and you're going to stay there for years, not understanding what you're doing is wrong. And I've met many game masters that will stay in the zone of long-winded speeches that don't work and all this for fucking decades and never improve. And even worse, they have players that will stay with them for decades, and those players won't know that there's a better experience outside of their game master. But I'll tell you this, the second one of those players touch that better experience, they'll never want to go back to him. They'll never want to go back to him. So there's a lot of lucky game masters in this world that have players that are just ignorant about what they're doing. That's it. They're ignorant about what they're doing. And if they weren't ignorant, that game master would be left in a ditch with no game. Anyway, for now, take care.